Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. They say few die as legends, and even fewer live as one. In the scorching heat of New Mexico, a young man with a smooth face and fast pistols was writing his name in the bloodiest and most romantic pages of the Old West. He did not know it was his last breath of freedom. His name was William H. Bonney, but the world knew him as Billy the Kid, the most legendary and controversial outlaw of the Old West. It was said that he had killed 21 men before turning 21, one for each year of life, although reliable records point to about 9. Still, the myth grew, fueled by sensationalist newspapers and the almost innocent charisma of the young gunslinger who was as quick with a smile as he was with a gun. Billy began his criminal path as an orphaned teenager, stealing food to survive. Soon, he was embroiled in the bloody Lincoln County War, fighting alongside local ranchers against powerful businessmen, which turned him for many into a kind of desert Robin Hood. But what made him a legend was his spectacular jailbreak in 1881. Sentenced to hang, Billy coldly killed 2 guards, stole their weapons, and casually walked out the front door, mounted on a horse, waving to anyone watching. It was as if he dared the world to catch him, and no one could, except one. Pat Garrett, a former ally and now sheriff of the territory, was tasked with hunting him down. After months of pursuit, Garrett found Billy in Fort Sumner. Hidden in a friend's house, the young man stepped out of a room on a dark night and was met with a single shot to the chest. He died there at 21, not knowing the end had arrived. But the end was never that simple. Since his death, theories have emerged claiming Billy survived, escaped, and lived under another identity for decades. Men came forward in the 20th century claiming to be him. Books were written, and attempts to exhume his body were blocked by legal disputes and unsolved mysteries. To some, Billy the Kid was a cold-blooded killer. To others, a rebel against injustice in a wild and unequal West. What is certain is that his image remains alive, not only in shoot-'em-up stories, but in the collective memory of a time when the line between hero and villain was drawn at the tip of a revolver. The night was dark and silent when a group of masked men emerged from the bushes along the railroad. When the train whistle blew in the distance, the trap was already set. In seconds, a section of the tracks was removed with surgical precision, forcing the locomotive to stop abruptly in the middle of nowhere. Horses neighed, passengers screamed, and thus began one of the boldest robberies of the Old West. The Union Pacific train robbery in Adair, Iowa, in 1873. The mastermind behind the plan was Jesse James, a former Confederate guerrilla who traded the battlefield for banks, stagecoaches, and cash-filled railroads. Jesse and his brother Frank had fought in the shadows during the Civil War, practicing brutal guerrilla tactics with groups like the Bushwhackers, known for surprise attacks and summary executions. When the war ended, they did not lay down their weapons. They simply changed targets. The James Younger gang was formed shortly after and quickly became synonymous with daring and cold-bloodedness. They were not mere thieves, they were armed strategists, terrain experts, always one step ahead of the law. On the night of the train robbery, Jesse led his men with military calm. The locomotive was taken within minutes, the guards subdued, and the trains safe blown open. The group stole about $3,000 in cash and valuables, a staggering amount by the standards of the time. What made this robbery historic, however, was how Jesse treated the passengers. It is said that he forbade his men from robbing any ordinary person, focusing the attack only on the railroad company's cargo. That fueled the myth of Jesse as a sort of Robin Hood of the West, an elegant outlaw who stood up to banks and big companies and protected the common citizen. Though it was never proven that he shared the money with the poor, the public, tired of corrupt and exploitative institutions of the time, embraced the legend. Wanted posters spread across the country. Detectives from the famous Pinkerton agency were hired to track him, but Jesse always seemed to slip away. The pursuit was so relentless that the Pinkertons attacked his mother's house with explosives, killing a half-brother and maiming the woman. This only increased public sympathy for Jesse James. But like every myth that lives on the fringes of the law, the end would be inevitable and treacherous. In 1882, already living under the false name of Thomas Howard, Jesse believed he was safe in his new home. He trusted few people, including the brothers Robert and Charles Ford, who had recently joined his gang. What Jesse did not know was that the Ford brothers had made a deal with the governor of Missouri. They would turn Jesse in exchange for a pardon and a $10,000 reward. On the morning of April 3rd, Jesse was at home with the Fords, adjusting a picture on the wall. Unarmed, off guard, with his back turned, that was the moment Robert Ford chose. He drew his gun and shot Jesse in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The man who defied banks, governments, and detectives for over a decade fell due to a silent betrayal inside his own home. His body was displayed to the public, and the legend became spectacle. Jesse James was buried in Kearney, Missouri, and his grave became a destination for curious visitors and admirers. To this day, his image divides opinion. To some, a dangerous criminal. To others, a symbol of rebellion against the system. At dawn, high on the plains of Wyoming, a sharp gunshot echoed through the hills. It was the kind of shot no one wanted to hear nearby, especially knowing who was around. His name sent chills even among the roughest men. Tom Horn. Born in 1860, Tom began his journey in the Old West as an interpreter and scout for the Army during the Apache Wars. He was an expert tracker, fluent in several indigenous languages, and familiar with the most inhospitable paths of the American territory. He hunted rebels, spied on tribes, and guided soldiers, a ghost among the native peoples. But as conflicts with indigenous peoples diminished, he found a new profession: killing for money. Wealthy ranchers in the West were tired of small-time cattlemen and alleged livestock thieves threatening their empires. That was when Tom Horn was hired as a security consultant. In practice, he was an elite gunslinger, discreet, efficient, and deadly. He left no trace, only bodies. They said when someone received a note signed by Tom Horn, they might as well start digging their own grave. His reputation spread like wildfire. He operated in the shadows, settling land disputes with the sound of a .30 caliber rifle. However, in 1901, his fate changed forever. A 14-year-old boy named Willie Nickel was found shot to death. Tom Horn was the main suspect. The only evidence was an alleged confession he had made, drunk, to an undercover officer. Even without witnesses, without the murder weapon, and with many inconsistencies in the case, Horn was arrested, tried, and sentenced to hang. The execution in 1903 was one of the first carried out by an automatic machine in the United States. But to this day, historians debate, was Tom Horn truly guilty or just the perfect scapegoat? Many believe he was betrayed by the very ranchers who hired him. Others say he finally paid for a long career of unpunished killings. His grave in Columbia Cemetery bears a simple headstone, but his legacy lives on in books, films, and ballads of the West. Tom Horn was a hero to some, a monster to others, but above all, a dark representation of an era when justice was a matter of aim, not judgment. No sound broke the silence of the Rocky Mountains, but hunters knew if crows flew over a lonely clearing and the bodies had no liver, it was a sign that liver-eating Johnson had passed by. His name already sent shivers down spines. His reputation was even worse. He was more than a man. He was a living legend of vengeance, fury, and savagery. John Jeremiah Johnson was a 19th century mountain man and hunter, a veteran of the Mexican War, but he became famous for a bloody vow to avenge the death of his Native American wife, murdered by a Crow Nation tribe. What followed seemed like a horror film mixed with a Western. Johnson began a solitary and brutal hunt, vowing to kill every warrior from the tribe who crossed his path. And he did not just kill, he removed the liver of his enemies and ate it raw as a form of insult and intimidation. Since the Crow believed a warrior spirit could not find peace without the liver. For over 25 years, Johnson spread terror across the wilderness of Montana and Wyoming. He was a master of survival, capable of enduring blizzards, fighting bears, and ambushing entire groups alone. Once, after being captured by Crow warriors and tied with leather straps, he supposedly killed the guard, cut one of his own wrists to escape, and walked more than 200 miles back to civilization. These accounts, though likely exaggerated over time, helped shape his nearly mythological reputation. Eventually, the Crow made peace with Johnson, recognizing his strength and courage as worthy of respect, and ending the cycle of blood. In his later years, he worked as a police officer, guide, and even as an extra in Wild West shows. He died in 1900 in a veteran's home, far from the brutal setting where he built his legend. Decades later, his body was exhumed and reburied with military honors in Cody, Wyoming, where his grave became a tourist attraction. Liver-eating Johnson is remembered not only as a symbol of the savagery of the West, but also as a chilling portrait of what vengeance can do to a man, a figure who crossed the line between hero, monster, and myth. It was night in the Arizona desert. Under the pale moonlight, silhouettes slid between the rocks, leaving only traces of footprints in the sand. They were American soldiers. They were searching for a man who seemed impossible to capture, a ghost of the desert. His name was spoken among the valleys with fear and respect: Geronimo. Born in the year 1829 among the Cherokee Apaches, Geronimo's life was marked by tragedy and fury. After his wife, mother, and children were brutally murdered by Mexican soldiers, he swore vengeance, not only against the Mexicans, but against all who invaded his people's land. From that moment on, he ceased to be just a warrior. He became a legend. For decades, Geronimo led a small group of Apache warriors in a war of resistance against the advance of white settlers and the United States Army. His ability to vanish into the mountains and reappear days later in devastating ambushes made him a true military nightmare. He escaped capture countless times, even with thousands of soldiers pursuing him, using the arid and mountainous terrain as a weapon. The newspapers of the time called him a bloodthirsty killer. To his people, he was a sacred protector. With each appearance, each incursion, a new chapter in the myth of Geronimo was born. The American Army mobilized more than 5,000 soldiers and hundreds of indigenous scouts to hunt him down, the largest United States military operation at the time against a single man. Geronimo made a decision that surprised the country. He surrendered to General Nelson Miles. It was the end of the Apache resistance, or so they thought. Even as a prisoner of war, Geronimo did not disappear from history. On the contrary, he became a kind of national celebrity. He attended fairs, parades, and even met President Theodore Roosevelt. He sold autographs, handmade objects, and shared his version of the story, always with a steady gaze and the voice of someone who knew the cost of the fight. Geronimo died in 1909, far from his homeland, never allowed to return, but his name endured through time. During World War II, paratroopers would shout, "Geronimo," when jumping from planes, paying tribute to the courage of a man who defied the impossible. Today, Geronimo is remembered not only as the last Apache warrior. He is remembered as an eternal symbol of resistance, dignity, and the fight for freedom, even when the whole world seems to conspire against it. In February of 1874, 6 starving men faced the harshest winter in the Rocky Mountains. Led by Alfred Packer, a supposed experienced guide, they sought to cross Colorado in search of work and gold. But the snow covered the trails, supplies ran out, and the cold seemed to freeze them to the bone. Months later, only Packer emerged from the mountains, thin, disoriented, but alive. He wore clothes belonging to his missing companions and carried suspicious strips of jerky in his pockets. When questioned, he told a story full of holes. The men had died one by one from natural causes, and he, driven by desperation, had eaten the bodies to avoid starving. But the truth reeked of blood. The bodies were later found, all mutilated, with crushed skulls and clear signs of violence. Packer's story changed several times. First, he claimed he had not killed anyone. Then he admitted to killing one man in self-defense. Finally, he confessed to killing them all, one by one, with an axe, but still insisted it was for survival. The court did not buy it. He was imprisoned, escaped, lived under a false name for nearly a decade, and was eventually recaptured. During the trial, he was called a monster, and the judge supposedly said, "Damn you, Alfred Packer. When you left the cave, there were 7 Democrats alive. Now there's only you." Sentenced to life in prison, he served only 18 years before being released for good behavior. He spent his final years trying to clear his name, saying he had only done what was necessary to survive. He died in 1907, buried under a tombstone that does not mention what made him famous. Ironically, his name lived on in a bizarre way. At the University of Colorado in Boulder, there is a cafeteria called Alfred Packer Grill, where the slogan is, "Eat the others before they eat you." The legend of the mountain cannibal still shocks everyone, a reminder that in the depths of winter and starvation, humans are capable of anything. Imagine a woman, thin with a firm gaze, capable of firing a bullet with clockwork precision, slicing through the air on a shooting range as if it were second nature. Her name was Annie Oakley, and in the late 19th century, she turned marksmanship into a true performance art. Born in 1860 in the state of Ohio, Annie was raised in extreme poverty, but what seemed like a hindrance became the fuel for her extraordinary talent. From a young age, she learned to hunt to help support her family, and soon developed uncanny skill with firearms. She was not just a good shot. Annie had an almost supernatural instinct for hitting moving targets with deadly accuracy. Her fame skyrocketed when, at the age of 15, she defeated Frank Butler, a seasoned sharpshooter, in a shooting competition. Butler, impressed by the young prodigy, not only acknowledged her talent, but also fell in love with her, and together they formed an unbeatable duo on stage. Annie was then invited to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, the spectacle that would immortalize her skill. In the arenas, she mesmerized crowds by shooting thrown objects out of the air, hitting apples, cigarettes, and even rings tossed by Buffalo Bill with flawless aim. Her fame spread across the country and around the world, making her an icon of the West. Annie was not just a sharpshooter. She was a woman who, in a man's world, redefined the meaning of courage and skill, breaking barriers and earning the respect of everyone around her. Throughout her career, she inspired thousands of women to challenge the limitations imposed by society, and proved that in the West, a woman could be just as lethal as any man. It all began with gold. When news spread in 1876 that nuggets had been found in the streams of the Black Hills in South Dakota, a flood of prospectors, bandits, prostitutes, and opportunists invaded the region, completely ignoring treaties with the Lakota natives who lived there. Thus was born Deadwood, a town that even in its name carried the promise of violence. With no formal laws, no real police force, and no judge who lasted more than a week, Deadwood became a boiling cauldron of booze, blood, and loaded dice. Brothels mixed with saloons, gunfights broke out over minor debts, and the constant sounds were clinking glasses and coins, often followed by the crack of a revolver. It was in this chaotic setting that James Butler Hickok arrived, better known as Wild Bill, a legendary gunslinger, former Army Scout, and a figure wrapped in tales blending courage and death. With his flashy style, long hair, and elegant clothing, Bill was famous both for his deadly aim and his love of card games. But his luck was about to run out. On a morning in August of 1876, Bill entered saloon number 10 for another poker round. Out of superstition, he always sat with his back to the wall. He wanted to see who entered. But that day, the only empty seat faced away from the door. Reluctantly, he sat down. Hours later, John Jack McCall, a bitter loser who had previously been humiliated by Bill in a card game, entered the saloon and, without saying a word, shot the gunslinger point blank in the back of the head. Wild Bill died instantly, spilling blood over the cards. In his hand, he held 2 aces and 2 eights, all black. Since then, that combination has been known as the dead man's hand. The murder of Hickok marked the height of lawlessness in Deadwood and branded it a town where even legends could fall by a shot to the back. The crime did go to trial, but the first ended with McCall acquitted by an improvised and clearly biased court. Only later, in a new trial outside the town, was he convicted and hanged. Deadwood, however, continued to grow and attract iconic figures like Calamity Jane, Seth Bullock, and other names that fueled the imagination of the Wild West. They said she drank more than any cowboy, cursed like an old sergeant, and was just as good with a rifle as any gunslinger in the West. Her name was Martha Jane Canary, but the world knew her as Calamity Jane, the woman who defied everything expected of her gender in the Old West. Raised amid poverty and tragedy, Jane lost her parents at a young age and, still a teenager, began dressing as a man to get jobs in caravans, stagecoaches, and military expeditions. In a world ruled by guns and alcohol, she carved out her space through grit, proving by action that she could do anything men did, and sometimes better. She was an Army scout, explorer in hostile indigenous territory, stagecoach driver, miner, and volunteer nurse during smallpox outbreaks, caring for abandoned patients when no one else dared approach. Her nickname, according to Jane herself, came from a heroic act in 1872 when she supposedly saved an Army captain from an indigenous ambush. They said he called her Calamity Jane because any man who messed with her was doomed. No one knows if the story is true, but like many others in her life, it became part of the folklore she fed in saloons and around campfires, often with a glass of whiskey in hand. And it was in the saloons where she lived her greatest glories and shames. She was a constant presence in Deadwood, where her figure, dirty, drunk, armed, and loud, caused both fascination and scandal. It was there that she met the great love of her life, Wild Bill Hickok, the legendary gunslinger and gambler. Jane claimed to have been his secret wife, although he never publicly confirmed the relationship. When Bill was shot in the back in 1876 while playing poker, Jane fell into a deep sadness. Over time, she became part of Wild West shows, telling stories of her life that masterfully mixed truth and invention. Later in life, with her health ruined by alcohol and living off handouts and memories, she made one final request: to be buried next to Hickok. The people of Deadwood honored her wish, they say out of pure mockery, as Bill never showed the same affection. And so, Calamity Jane was laid to rest beside the man she loved until the end, even without knowing if she had been loved in return. An untamable woman who lived on her own terms amid gunfire, horses, and bottles, and who is still remembered as a whirlwind in skirts that swept up the myths of the Old West. The crowd gathered in tense silence in front of the jail in Ada, Oklahoma, as the most feared man in the southern United States faced his final destiny. It was James Killer Miller, the elegant gunslinger who wore bulletproof coats and never hesitated to shoot a man in the back. Cold, calculating, and always clean, both in his clothes and in his executions, Miller built his reputation as a hired killer, murdering sheriffs, politicians, ranching rivals, and anyone who was on the payroll. It is said he murdered at least 14 men, though the real number may be much higher. His style was peculiar. He attended church, avoided profanity, and did not drink. Yet he accepted death contracts with the same calm he used to greet a neighbor. What made him even more feared was his preference for ambush. Many of his targets only realized they were marked when they dropped dead from a bullet in the back. In 1909, Miller was hired to kill A.A. Allen, a former sheriff who had made many enemies. The crime, however, caused public outrage, and Miller ended up being arrested along with other accomplices. Fearing that he would escape once again, as he had many times before thanks to political connections and lack of evidence, the citizens of Ada decided to take matters into their own hands. In the early morning of April 19th, a mob stormed the jail, dragged Miller and the others to the local barn, and improvised a gallows, sealing the end of one of the most enigmatic and contradictory killers of the Old West. Ironically, the man who always chose to kill in silence had a loud end at the hands of mob justice, with no chance to shoot from behind. What began as petty thefts turned into the most famous gang of the West. By the end of the 19th century, two names sent chills through banks and railroad companies: Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Butch, born Robert Leroy Parker, was charismatic, strategic, and intelligent, not the typical brutal outlaw. Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, was quick on the trigger and silent as night. Together, they led the gang known as the Wild Bunch, which terrorized the Old West with a bold sequence of meticulously planned heists. One of the most famous was the Union Pacific train robbery in 1899, where they blew up the safe and fled with thousands of dollars, leaving behind trails of gunpowder and bewilderment. Unlike many criminals of the time, Butch avoided violence whenever possible. He preferred strategic exits, elaborate escapes, and disguises. The gang was organized, used secret hideouts, and had pre-planned escape routes. But as their fame grew, so did the bounty on their heads, and the pressure from detective agencies, especially the feared Pinkerton Agency. In 1901, realizing the net was closing in, the two made an unprecedented decision: to flee to South America. Yes, they traded the American West for the Andes. They first went to Argentina, where they bought land and pretended to be ranchers. But the outlaw blood spoke louder. They soon returned to crime, robbing banks and trains in Bolivia, where they became local legends. In 1908, however, came the end, or at least the official version. After robbing a payroll transport in Bolivia, Butch and Sundance were cornered by soldiers in a village called San Vicente. A fierce gunfight broke out. In the end, 2 bodies were found, and Bolivian officials claimed they were the legendary outlaws. But doubts persist to this day. There was no definitive confirmation of the dead men's identities. Some swear Butch returned to the United States and lived as a mechanic until the 1930s. Others claim Sundance escaped and died peacefully in Argentina. With no death certificate or confirmed grave, the theories multiplied. What no one denies is the impact the duo left behind. 2 men who defied the system with intelligence, daring, and a strange personal code. Outlaws, yes, but also icons of an era when the line between villain and hero was drawn with gunpowder and charm. No one expected the most talked about outlaw of 1899 to be, in fact, a woman in a corset, with a determined look and a revolver under her coat. Pearl Hart was not born a criminal, but life gave her few chances to take a different path. Daughter of a respected Canadian family, she attended boarding school and had a typical youth, until she met an abusive man with whom she eloped and married. From there, her downfall was swift. Abandonment, unstable jobs, addictions, losses. Amid the chaos, Pearl decided she would not live as a victim. When her brother was wounded in war and she had no money to visit him, she made a radical decision. Armed with a revolver and dressed as a man, she joined her accomplice, Joe Boot, and robbed a stagecoach near Globe, Arizona. The scene was like something out of a movie. Pearl ordering the passengers out, being courteous to the women, returning money to those who claimed they needed it, and then fleeing on horseback into the desert. For a few days, they evaded the authorities, but were soon captured. When Pearl's identity was revealed, the story exploded in the newspapers. A woman, armed, robbing stagecoaches? It was unthinkable and irresistible to the public. Pearl became a national sensation. Her interrogations became interviews. Her black and white portraits circulated across the United States. Admired for her beauty and boldness, she began receiving flowers in jail and was treated almost like a guest instead of a prisoner. At Yuma Prison, her case became a dilemma: where to house a woman among so many male criminals. The warden built a special cell just for her, and according to rumors, Pearl loved receiving visitors, often curious journalists and even politicians. After a few years, she was released under mysterious circumstances. They say her fame had become too inconvenient for the prison system, and perhaps someone important helped her in secret. What happened next is one of the greatest mysteries of the Old West. Pearl Hart vanished. During the dark days of the American Civil War, when brutality and violence knew no limits, one man stood out not only for his combat skills, but for his extreme cruelty. This man was William T. Bloody Bill Anderson, one of the most feared Confederate guerrillas in the West. Born in 1839 in Missouri, Anderson began life as a simple farmer, but war turned him into something very different. When the Civil War broke out, Anderson joined the Confederates and, after some victories and defeats, became the leader of a guerrilla gang that terrorized not only Unionists, but anyone considered an enemy of the South. The nickname Bloody Bill came from his reputation for committing horrific tortures and massacring civilians without mercy. His combat methods were sadistic, and he was known for ambushing and killing Union soldiers in brutal ways, often murdering prisoners and burning entire villages. But the turning point in his bloody fame came in 1864 when he led an attack on a small town in Missouri. The mission was simple: destroy and kill. The guerrillas under his command invaded the town, killed dozens of civilians, and in some cases even dismembered their victims' bodies. Anderson and his men spared no one, women, children, or the elderly. His cruelty seemed to know no bounds. His behavior was not just a reflection of the war's brutality, but a reflection of his own ruthless and remorseless nature. He saw war as a battlefield where any action, no matter how violent, was justified in the name of the Southern cause. When the Union Army began hunting down his guerrillas, Anderson made even more enemies, attacking not only Northern forces, but anyone who reported him or was suspected of siding with the Union. His thirst for vengeance against his opponents was the driving force behind his terror campaign. In 1864, however, his life of violence came to a bloody end. Anderson was ambushed and killed by a Union unit, and his body was left to rot without honor. Still, his fame as one of the most brutal guerrillas of the Civil War endures, remembered today as an example of the war's darkest shadows. They appeared like ghosts in the early morning fog, riding mud-covered horses, waving Confederate flags, and with eyes burning with hatred. They were known as Quantrill's Raiders, one of the most savage and feared bands of the American Civil War. Led by William Clark Quantrill, these guerrillas did not fight by conventional military tactics. They fought for revenge, power, and chaos. Quantrill was a former teacher who turned into something much darker. Instead of leading regular soldiers, he commanded a group of deserters, bandits, and fanatics who specialized in lightning raids on Unionist towns. Their most brutal operation occurred in 1863 when they invaded Lawrence, Kansas, a city known for housing Northern sympathizers. The attack became known as the Lawrence Massacre. In just a few hours, more than 150 men and boys were coldly killed, homes and stores were burned, and the city was devastated. The raiders did not follow the rules of war. They wore Union soldier uniforms to confuse enemies, ambushed convoys, and slit prisoners' throats. Quantrill claimed he was fighting for Southern justice, but his methods bordered on sadism. Among his followers were names that would later also become infamous, such as Bloody Bill Anderson and even Jesse James, who would go on to become the most famous outlaw of the West. But the group's savagery began to disgust even their Confederate allies. Quantrill lost control of the gang, which splintered into even more violent factions. In 1865, with the war nearing its end, Quantrill was ambushed by Union troops and shot. He died shortly afterward, but his legend and that of his raiders lived on. Today, Quantrill is remembered as an ambiguous figure, a hero to some Southerners of the time, but a cruel monster to most historians. He was too young to drink legally, but old enough to kill without flinching. Known as Cherokee Bill, Crawford Goldsby began his criminal path at 18 and soon became one of the most dangerous and unpredictable bandits of the Old West. The son of a formerly enslaved man and a Cherokee woman, he grew up amid the chaos of indigenous reservations and racial segregation in a territory where the law was just a distant idea. But what made him feared was not just his deadly aim or quick draw, it was his total disregard for human life. They say his first victim was his own brother-in-law, killed during a petty argument. After that, he dove fully into crime, robbing trains, stealing from banks, and eliminating anyone who tried to stop him, including guards, sheriffs, and even innocent civilians. With his wide-brimmed hat and defiant attitude, he quickly became a legend, a wanted man as feared as Jesse James, but without the honor code that some attributed to other outlaws of the era. Cherokee Bill was pure rage and impulse. When he was finally captured in 1895 after an ambush and taken to trial, he tried to escape prison by killing a guard with a hidden revolver. He failed. He was sentenced to hang for murder, and on March 17, 1896, at the age of 20, he calmly climbed the gallows. When asked if he had any final words, he replied coldly, "I think this is the toughest moment of my life." On the stifling night of August 19, 1871, the small town of Newton, Kansas, earned a place in the pantheon of the bloodiest stories of the Old West, and it all began with a saloon fight. Newton was a typical railroad town, full of cowboys, cheap liquor, gambling, and boiling testosterone. But that night, the tension between two rival groups, the allies of local policeman Billy Bailey and the friends of former carpenter Mike McCluskey, reached the breaking point. It all began with a political argument during the sheriff election. McCluskey shot Bailey inside a saloon, killing him. The crime split the town, and everyone knew revenge would come quickly. Days later, during Bailey's funeral, his allies swore they would settle the score. That night, in the Hyde Park Saloon, while bottles clinked and cigar smoke mixed with the smell of sweat, the tension exploded. Several armed men were at the bar. McCluskey was confronted by James Riley, a sick young man with tuberculosis who could barely stand, but who idolized McCluskey. Out of nowhere, the gunfire began. Some say it was started by Bailey's friends. Others claim it broke out among several drunken gunmen. In seconds, the saloon turned into hell. After more than 20 gunshots, bodies fell and screams filled the street. When the dust settled, 7 men were dead or dying, including McCluskey. And what no one expected happened. James Riley, the thin, fragile-looking boy, drew 2 pistols and became the tragic hero of the night. They say he killed 4 men on his own in defense of McCluskey with astonishing precision for someone so sick. After that, he vanished from history as if the devil himself had taken him. The Hyde Park shootout was one of the most violent and chaotic in Western history. And unlike the cinematic stage duels, it was a messy, impulsive bloodbath. No clear heroes, no real justice. Just another reminder that on the dusty streets of Kansas, all it took was a sideways glance and a nervous finger to turn a town into an improvised cemetery. Under the scorching sun of the Arizona desert, among snakes, scorpions, and burning sand, there was a place that made even the toughest criminals tremble. The Yuma Territorial Prison. Built in 1876 along the Colorado River, it soon earned a dark nickname, the Hell Prison. But what made this facility stand out was not just the suffocating heat or the inhospitable location. It was the fact that the prisoners themselves were forced to build their own cells from stone, brick by brick, as if sealing their own fate. Yuma housed thieves, murderers, forgers, and even women convicted of immoral conduct. Inside, suffering was the law. The cells, made of iron and stone, burned during the day and froze at night. There was no privacy. Latrines were holes in the ground, and the guard showed no mercy. Those who rebelled were thrown into the dark cell, a windowless pit where prisoners were chained in total darkness, surrounded by rats, their own filth and madness. Even so, the prison was considered advanced by the standards of the time. There was a library, classes, and even music. But that did not lessen the terror. There were escape attempts, but few succeeded. One of the most famous involved 3 prisoners who killed a guard and tried to escape on horseback, but they were hunted like animals and killed in the desert. Others died of dysentery, scurvy, heat stroke, or simply went insane. In total, more than 3,000 inmates passed through Yuma before the prison closed in 1909. Today, the site is a museum, but visitors report hearing screams at night, footsteps in empty cells, and shadows crossing the halls.